Nkasango was just an ordinary man who lived in the village. His job was an ironmonger, but because he was poor, that no one really took him seriously. He maybe made the odd ring for a wedding. He maybe made the odd horseshoe for an old man in the village. But he was not the type of a guy that a king, for example, would go to commission something beautiful like the gates of the palace. So no one took him seriously because he was never, ever commissioned by anyone important, the villagers thought. See, in Africa, your status in the community depends on who has commissioned your work. And as an artist, or anyone, for example, if you have ever had a work asked to do something for a king or a president, then people will see you as important. So Kasango worked for years without ever being asked. One day a king had a dream, and this dream really upset him. He couldn't interpret the dream, but he knew he didn't like it. So he called his young men. He told the dream to them, and the wise men couldn't interpret it either. So nobody knew what the dream meant, but they knew that it needed to be interpreted because if the king was not happy, then the entire village was never going to be happy, especially the king's men. Hmm. So word got out that they needed people that were skilled to come and interpret the dream. So first they called on the scholars, the most educated, high class of society to come and interpret this dream. So the scholars came, but none of them could do it. They called on the poets, but no, the king was not impressed. Mind you, the king was getting agitated now that he decreed that anybody that came and told an interpretation of the dream that he was not happy about, they would be getting the chop on the block. So very few people came up, but Kasango dared to go and interpret the dream. First of all, he thought to himself, the king probably doesn't even know who he is. The king's men didn't know who he was, so he needed to make an impression. So he went to the palace and he stood there in front of the king and he was respectful and said, His Royal Highness, I hear you had a dream and I would love to interpret it for you. The king looked at him, the poor old man. His shoes were all tattered, his clothes were tattered, his hair was uncombed. He probably haven't washed in days, the king thought to himself. What kind of a human being is this? But because the king has tried everybody that was important, and none of them could have came with anything near enough to make him happy, so what did he have to lose after all? And he thought it might be actually fun to watch him getting the chop under the block. So the king sat him down and asked his king men to bring him a drink. So Kansako said, Before I start, I would like to have a request. Hmm, the king thought. A request? He said, Yes. He said, I would like to go away after you've told me the dream so that I can go away and have a good think about it before coming back to you to interpret it. Oh, that was a game changer. Nobody has ever talked to the king like that. So the king's men stood back, not knowing what to do. They were absolutely startled, lost for words. But the king thought to himself, I'll give him that. So The king agreed. Okay, so the king started telling his dream to Nkasango. Onda ke nyanam kuqale ngolu hlobo. Siye saya sathi. The king talked and talked and talked. Nkasango was talking to himself. Whoa! Hey, le inkosi iyahlupha. This is really, really bothering this king, he thought to himself. So he said, as I have requested, I will go and ponder, and then when I have really thought hard about it, I will come back with the interpretation of it. So Nkasango went home. When he got home, he thought to himself, how am I even going to interpret this? So he asked his father, an old wise man, a wise man of the village. Tata, ndingali phutha kanjani eliphupha ndicinge. But his father said, not to worry, my son. Remember, you are the most intelligent man in this village. Nkasango, I knew one day you will become the greatest man that this village has ever seen. Now, my son, it is your time. So Nkasango thought to himself, and he thought, and he thought, and he thought, and he thought. And then he went up again to the king, up there in the palace. Oh. He knocked, and the gate opened, and the king was standing there looking at him with delight. He actually thought, finally, it's either he is going to give me the interpretation of this dream, or else he's going to face the block and the chop. So Nkasango started with how we greet the king. Sawubona baba. The king stood there and nodded. Thetha nyana wam, thetha, ndimamele. Speak, I'm listening. Nkasango said, I had a dream about your dream, and the spirits have asked me to request a few things before I interpret the dream. Ndimamele, thetha, said the king. I would like to request 1,000 liters of tears. The king thought. The king's men stood back, their shoulders down, not knowing how this is going to happen. The king nodded slowly. Anything else? And said, yes, I need 50 bags of hair. The king knew now this was getting serious. So he decreed that every person in the village come and cry until all the barrels were filled. They needed these 1,000 liters of tears, and each and every person's hair be shaved and fill those 50 bags. So the following days, the villagers went. They actually volunteered to do it because in Africa, whatever the king says, the king's word is final. Eventually, everybody, after crying, the barrels were full. And the hair, the 50 bags of hair. So they were all sent to Nkasango's house. So out of that, Nkasango started working in his shed. He started working until he produced the most beautiful statue. And on it, it was like a waterfall. He was using all the tears as a waterfall, and it had beautiful hair. And Nkasango brought this statue to the king, and he says, this is the interpretation of your dream, that your kingdom shall have no end. it will flow from one generation to the next. And the hair are all the heads of the village that have come together to support you, for you are the head of the village, the head of the people. Oh, the king was delighted with that interpretation of the dream, and he ordered that the cows be slaughtered. The whole village rejoiced. There was food that was brought in, but most importantly, he didn't forget Nkasango. He thanked him, and he decreed that he was the most important person in that village. And from that day on, Nkasango got all his work from the king. He made the palace's gates. He made the finest jewels for the king. And he was a well-respected man. I hope you enjoyed that story. Esixhosa sithi "Xosi iyaphela eyam intsomi," and there I end my story. Thank you.